By many accounts, Canada is a leader when it comes to lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender rights. But in many parts of the world, being gay is a crime. Gays and lesbians find themselves confronted by human rights abuses and constant threats. And in some countries, being gay is punishable by death. Here now to tell us about the fight to have LGBT rights recognized on a global stage, Boris Dittrich. He is Advocacy Director of the Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender Rights Program at Human Rights Watch. And we're very happy to have you here at TVO tonight.
My pleasure.
Okay, admittedly a broad question to get us started here, but we'll focus in after you give us the lay of the land. What's the state of LGBT rights around the world today, generally speaking?
Generally speaking, actually, we see two developments, a positive development. Many more countries are introducing same-sex marriage bills and non-discrimination acts, so that's good. But we also see countries where homosexual conduct will be criminalized or penalized more heavily than already is the case.
Can you make us a bit of a list of the latter category?
Yeah, we have 193 member states of the United Nations, and out of the 193 states, about 76 countries criminalize homosexual conduct. And then in some countries, the law is not really enforced, but in many other countries, gay men or lesbian women are imprisoned because of their sexual orientation.
My hunch is, though, 25 or 50 years ago, that list was a lot longer. So would you say progress is being made?
Well, if you look 25 years back, oh, definitely progress has been made. Actually, in the last, let's say, 6-7 years, a lot of progress has been made, because I started working for Human Rights Watch 6 years ago. And at that time, the United Nations didn't really speak about sexual orientation, gender identity, and human rights abuses. And now we see that a country like South Africa is actually leading the struggle against discrimination and violence against LGBT people.
Well, in fact, last year, I think it was the UN Human Rights Commission, right, or the Human Rights Council passed a resolution endorsing the rights of LGBT people.
Exactly.
So, I mean, that's an historic
the example
development
of this enormous leap and enormous progress. On the other hand, we shouldn't close our eyes that there are so many human rights violations simply because somebody loves somebody else of the same gender. And we see that on a daily basis. I could give you the example of Cameroon, an African country. When people find out that you're gay or lesbian, they call the police and you're arrested. And judges will sentence you to a prison sentence of, let's say, 3 to 5 years, simply because you are suspected of being gay or lesbian.
What's the charge?
The charge is homosexual, or I should say, in the law it says homosexual conduct is criminalized, but the charges are usually you are gay, so your identity is criminalized, and judges don't care about the letter of the law. So if your neighbor calls the police and says, I don't like him and I know he's gay, you might end up in prison.
The Human Rights Council's resolution, what has the practical effect of that been?
Well, first of all, 5-6 years ago, nobody at the UN was talking about this issue, and now we had this vote, and the majority of the countries in the Human Rights Council supported South Africa. That means that, for instance, in the resolution, the High Commissioner for Human Rights was instructed to write a report about the state of LGBT rights in the world. She did so in December 2011. And it's a shocking read, because you read that people are being imprisoned because of their sexual orientation. And so that report is now very influential in the world, because governments are really scrutinizing their own laws, and hopefully we will see some more changes.
But the resolution doesn't have there's no legally binding impact on member states, is there?
No, not yet. So it's a long process, and I could be here 10 years from now, and then we will still discuss a lot of problems. But for instance, I would say that the report of the High Commissioner for Human Rights also has a positive influence. Yesterday we learned that in Malawi, African country, the Minister of Justice has said, actually, maybe our law, our sodomy law, is unconstitutional. So why don't we introduce a moratorium on arrests of lesbian women and gay men? So that's already something. And so now they are, in the background, the report of the High Commissioner, now they're scrutinizing their own legislation.
Let me follow up on that Malawi example. The fact that a politician has said that, have the police and or military forces abided by that edict that he's brought forward?
Well, we've seen that activists, human rights defenders from Malawi have been very active in addressing this issue to their own government, and the government responded. And then, of course, the LGBT groups in Malawi and Human Rights Watch, of course, will follow closely what will happen with this moratorium.
Okay. I want to ask you about something that you co-organized. This was a document called the Yogyakarta Principles. What was that?
It's a very difficult name. It's a city in Indonesia, and at the end of 2006, all kind of legal experts who were more or less affiliated to the United Nations, they convened there and they actually translated all existing human rights to sexual orientation and gender identity. Because in many countries in the world, when you say you're not allowed to torture somebody or to lock somebody up, without somebody having committed a crime, then people say, but we didn't realize this applies also to lesbian women or gay men. So the Yogyakarta Principles, that's a document which translates all existing human rights into accessible language, actually. And when you read the document, you all of a sudden understand the big gap between internationally recognized human rights and the state of affairs for LGBT people.
So let's follow up and figure out why this is still the way it is. When countries tell you, yes, we still discriminate against LGBT people, and here's why, what's the why?
Well, I can give you an example. I was in Uganda and I spoke to one of the ministers and I showed him the Yogyakarta Principles and we talked about all kind of international treaties. And then he said to me, well, when Uganda signed the treaties, we didn't realize this was applicable to gay men and lesbian women because, and then they usually come up with reasons like it's against our tradition, it's against our culture, it's against our religion, and therefore we can make a distinction between straight people and homosexual people, and homosexual people are less.
Well, when somebody says, God has decided that those who live that way are to be smited and punished, it's kind of the end of the conversation, isn't it? What
no,
do you
it's
do
not.
about that?
Fortunately not. Otherwise, Human Rights Watch would be out of business.
No, but if it's the Word of God, how are you going to tell somebody that they've misinterpreted the Word of God?
Well, I'm not saying they misinterpret the Word of God, but I'm talking about the universality of human rights. And we have a very staunch supporter in the UN Secretary General, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, who has made many speeches. And he always says, human rights must carry the day. So when cultural or traditional or religious arguments are used against LGBT people, he says, no, wait a minute. Universality means that universal rights and let's say LGBT rights are human rights, and everybody must be treated equally.
But based on your experience, if there's a country that firmly believes that for religious reasons or for deeply held traditional or cultural reasons, they cannot extend equal rights to LGBT people, how long does it take to sort of change that thinking?
Well, that's of course a long-term process. What we do see is that when human rights defenders in those countries publish their personal stories, how the sodomy law in their country will affect their lives, sometimes people are moved and touched by, by the severity of their personal stories and the way the law is afflicting them. So sometimes we see that people then realize, okay, maybe we should change the law, like in Malawi. And of course, international pressure is very important.
Can you give me an example of where international pressure may have worked?
Well, yes, I can give you many examples. The funny thing is now we are talking about the criminalization of homosexual conduct, but when we speak about transgender people in many parts of the world, if you as a transgender person want to obtain a new document, an identification document, a new passport for instance, with the preferred gender, in many countries, also in the West, it says that you need to undergo sex reassignment surgery. Mm-hmm. And that's a violation of human rights, that the government tells you, to undergo a surgery in a healthy body simply to give a new documentation. So a lot of pressure from international transgender activists led to many countries now reviewing their law. My own country, the Netherlands, recently, after Human Rights Watch produced a report, said, okay, we are in violation of international human rights standards and we are going to change our law. So pressure really helps.
We should mention, you have a kind of a unique place in history on this front, right? You're a former politician in the Netherlands who moved the motion to bring in same-sex marriage.
Yes, that's correct. I was the first openly gay member of parliament in the Netherlands. I entered parliament in 1994. That was the first time I was elected. And in 1994 I presented the same-sex marriage discussion, and I asked the government to introduce that bill. The government refused. I managed to get a majority in parliament, and then, to make a long story short, in 2001 the Netherlands became the first country in the world to have same-sex marriage. And I'm very proud of that, because I remember in all those discussions people said, nowhere in the world same-sex marriages take place, so why would we, the Dutch, would we be the only ones in the world? And you know, I tried to convince them, and now you see that every year countries are following suit. The United Kingdom, France, New Zealand will follow. So it's wonderful to see. It's a symbol of equality.
So you were number one, Netherlands, Belgium number two.
And I think Canada and South Africa
Might have been number
were
three.
number 3 and 4, yes.
Okay, speaking of South Africa, because your organization has a complicated relationship with South Africa, if I can put it that way. On the one hand, they've made, and I've heard others say, they have made major strides in recognizing the human rights of many different minorities and LGBT and so on. But on the other hand, you have found extensive discrimination on a daily basis in the Republic of South Africa on this front.
Yes,
how do you
that's
reconcile
correct.
that?
Well, it's very difficult. The law is great. The Constitution of South Africa is wonderful. It was actually the first constitution which recognized non-discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. This was in the Mandela era. But we also see that, for instance, lesbian and gender non-conforming women are being raped. And it's called corrective rape, especially in townships and rural areas. And the police has a very difficult, approach to it. Sometimes we discovered when we did our research that when women went to the police to report a rape, they were not really helped, not at all actually. So yeah, it's difficult, and that's why we published a report, and there's now a state committee reviewing the approach of the police and trying to protect lesbian and gender non-conforming women.
Has your organization met with South African officials on this?
Yes.
And
yes.
Are they attentive?
Yes, actually, yes. They were quite responsive. Of course, there is a high level of violence in South Africa, not only to lesbian women. So the police has a lot of work to do, but of course it should also protect lesbian women.
As you look around the world, what institution or government or world body or whatever should be responsible for seeing these rights improved?
I would say the United Nations, but
they can't really do anything,
no,
can they?
That's the problem. Yeah. I remember that after we did our research in Cameroon, and Cameroon was up for review at the United Nations, the Human Rights Council, I went to Geneva. I presented our report, and then the government of Cameroon had to respond, and they denied actually everything. But the Human Rights Committee then said at the end of the day, listen, Cameroon, we recommend that you really should change your laws and should decriminalize. And then Cameroon says, but we don't want to do that. Mm-hmm. And then there is no real mechanism at the United Nations to force a country to do so. So we need to persuade people and need to show them that human rights are for everybody.
So you really, there is no real institution that can get this done, right? This is a public relations war in some respects that will have to be fought over and over again.
Yeah, and we need to find allies, because sometimes it looks like when people are using religious arguments that there is no way that you can convince people to treat everybody equally, but also within religious groups you find allies, so we need to team up with them, and of course with the human rights defenders on the ground in those countries, and together fight for justice.
Okay, we had an incident not too long ago in Canada, and I want to find out if it really had impact. The Minister of Foreign Affairs for Canada gave a speech recently where he criticized some African countries, some Caribbean countries, which were in the Commonwealth, saying that their record on gay and lesbian rights was not good. Too many abuses, too many violations of human rights, and he called them out, these countries, for doing so. Do you think statements like that by a Canadian politician have any influence at all?
Unfortunately, sometimes they might even have a negative influence. And of course, the minister is right in what he says, but the question is sometimes silent diplomacy behind the scenes, working behind the scenes, putting pressure on governments might have more effect than publicly denouncing policies and laws, because people might get offended. In this case, this happened at the conference of the Inter-Parliamentary Union. I've been a member of it myself, so I know exactly how those meetings go. And the Speaker of the House of Uganda felt offended. She went back to Uganda, and now the anti-homosexuality bill has been reintroduced in Parliament and will be discussed. So in this case,
there's a connection between those two things?
Yes, because she was in Canada, and she actually said to the minister in this meeting, we are not a colony of Canada, and she was really quite aggressive, to use that term. She came back to Uganda, and very heroically people praised her for standing up against Canada and the West. Because a lot of countries, they pretend that homosexuality is a Western thing, and that Western countries are imposing their values on countries like Uganda, which is of course not the case, but they use that as a pretext. So sometimes we have to be very mindful when and in what circumstances we really address these issues.
Well, this was a significant year in a few ways as well on this file, because remember, the Vice President of the United States came out for same-sex marriage, and then a few days later, the President of the United States came out for same-sex marriage. I think Jamaica's Prime Minister has spoken out against homophobia this year as well. Those obviously have symbolic significance, but do you think when things like that happen, it actually moves the yardsticks along?
Well, it depends, because there are always politicians, whenever elections are coming up, who like to use the LGBT community, gay men, lesbian women, as some kind of scapegoat. And they are doing fear-mongering. So in a country like Uganda, when elections come up, all of a sudden the gays get the blame of many things, and then people rally behind it against gays. There is a lot of homophobia. But politicians don't address issues like poverty or corruption, you know, the big issues in their country. So sometimes when, for instance, Barack Obama, the current president of the United States, says, I'm in favor of same-sex marriage, it might be used against the LGBT community in a specific country. I'm not saying that Obama shouldn't say that, of course, but we should really see that sometimes politicians play an evil game with the LGBT community.
An evil game?
Yes.
You have felt that?
Yes, in many countries. Actually, I've met politicians who told me privately, we understand that criminalization of homosexual conduct doesn't lead to better health care for people or a health situation of the people. But I'm a politician, I want to be re-elected. If I will address this issue and if I will advocate for decriminalization, I will not be re-elected. And so what do you expect from me? So yeah, they play a game.
What do you expect? But you expect more.
I expect more, and that's why we try to convince them by seeking the dialogue, but also by putting pressure on governments, by publishing our reports with facts and exposing their attitude.
Got it. Boris Dittrich, it's awfully good of you to join us at TVO tonight. Thanks very much for your views and sharing them with us.
Well, thanks for having me.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.